Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It means everything. I also want to give a huge thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting this topic. This one's for you. Now, let's begin. Look up at the night sky. What do you see? Stars. Maybe the moon. Perhaps a satellite drifting slowly across the darkness. A moving point of light that doesn't twinkle like the distant suns around it. If you're in a city, the glow of light pollution might wash out most of the cosmos, leaving only the brightest objects visible. If you're in the countryside, away from human illumination, you might see thousands of stars, the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a river of light. But regardless of where you are, regardless of how clear the night, there's something you cannot see. Something invisible yet absolutely crucial to the world you live in. The infrastructure. Modern civilization doesn't run on roads anymore. Not primarily. It doesn't run on railways or shipping lanes or fibre optic cables alone. It runs through the sky. Through a layer of space beginning just 60 miles above your head and extending out to 22,000 miles, a region where thousands upon thousands of machines circle the Earth, transmitting the invisible signals that hold our technological world together. Think about your day. You woke up to an alarm on your phone. Your phone knew the exact time because it's synchronized with satellites. You checked the weather. That forecast came from satellites monitoring atmospheric conditions across the globe. You drove to work. Your car's navigation system triangulated your position using signals from satellites orbiting overhead. You made a phone call. Even if you used a cell tower, that tower coordinated with others using satellite timing signals. You checked your bank account. That transaction was verified through networks that depend on satellite communication links. None of this is visible. None of it requires your awareness or understanding. It simply works, invisibly, constantly, reliably. We trust this system completely. We've built our entire civilization around assumptions of orbital infrastructure. We don't think about it because we don't have to. We assume it works because it always has, at least in our lifetimes. But what if the space above us is already more dangerous than we're being told? What if the very technology we depend on is creating a threat that could shut down orbital access for generations? What if debris from old satellites and destroyed spacecraft is accumulating faster than anyone publicly admits? And what if the people who know about this threat, the scientists and military officials and space agency administrators who monitor orbital space, have decided that public awareness would cause more damage than the crisis itself? Tonight, we're going to explore a conspiracy theory that doesn't require aliens or secret bases or exotic technology. It requires only physics, politics, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones told through silence. Sometimes the greatest threats are the ones we're actively discouraged from discussing. This is the story of the orbit we're not allowed to talk about. This is the story of a problem that might already be past the point of solving, unfolding in the darkness above our heads while we sleep, unaware and unwarned. This is the story of the Cascade. Chapter 1. The Scientist Who Warned Us. In 1978, a NASA scientist named Donald J. Kessler published a paper that most people have never heard of. The paper had a technical title, the kind that only specialists would read. Collision Frequency of Artificial Satellites, the Creation of a Debris Belt. It appeared in the Journal of Geophysical Research, a respected but hardly mainstream publication. It wasn't classified. It wasn't secret. It was simply ignored by anyone outside a small community of orbital mechanics experts and space debris researchers. Ignored because the problem it described seemed too distant, too theoretical, too inconvenient to address. Kessler wasn't a wild-eyed prophet or a fringe scientist. He was exactly the opposite. He worked at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, one of NASA's premier facilities, the nerve center of American human spaceflight operations. His job involved tracking orbital debris, cataloguing the fragments of destroyed satellites, and spent rocket stages that accumulate in the space around Earth. It was unglamorous work, the kind of careful, methodical analysis that forms the foundation of space operations but rarely makes headlines. At the time, there weren't many satellites up there. A few hundred, maybe, depending on how you counted. The space age was still young. Sputnik had launched only 21 years earlier. The moon landings were less than a decade in the past. Space felt infinite, a vast emptiness surrounding our small planet. The idea that we could actually clutter it, that we could fill orbital space with enough junk to create lasting problems, seemed absurd to most people. But Kessler saw something others didn't. He had a mathematician's mind, an understanding of exponential growth and cascade effects. He recognized patterns in the debris data that suggested trouble ahead. He understood that orbital space, despite its vast size, wasn't actually infinite in practical terms. Useful orbits, the altitudes and inclinations that made satellites valuable for communication or observation, were limited. And once you placed enough objects in those limited regions, probability started working against you. His paper proposed a scenario that would later bear his name, Kessler syndrome. The concept was elegant in its logic and terrifying in its implications. Once the density of objects in any given orbital region reaches a critical threshold, collisions become not just possible but inevitable. The mathematics were straightforward. More objects meant more chances for impacts. Each collision creates fragments, hundreds or thousands of them depending on the energy involved. Those fragments don't fall to Earth, at least not quickly. They remain in orbit, spreading across their orbital plane, creating new hazards for other spacecraft. Eventually you reach a point where collisions create more debris than atmospheric drag removes. The process becomes self-sustaining, a runaway chain reaction. One collision leads to fragments that cause more collisions, creating more fragments, in an exponential cascade that fills orbital regions with billions of high-velocity projectiles moving at speeds where even a paint fleck can punch through metal. In this scenario, launching new satellites becomes suicidal. Existing satellites are gradually destroyed, one by impacts they can't avoid or predict. The infrastructure of modern civilization, all those invisible signals we depend on, crumbles, and orbital space becomes unusable for decades, perhaps centuries, until natural decay gradually clears the debris field. When Kessler first proposed this idea, it was purely theoretical, a mathematical possibility, something that might happen if we weren't careful, if we didn't manage orbital operations responsibly, if we allowed debris to accumulate unchecked. Space agencies acknowledged it the way governments acknowledge long-term risks like climate change or pandemic preparedness. They formed committees, they published reports, they promised to address it eventually when it became more pressing, when the danger moved from theoretical to practical. But the thing about exponential processes is that they don't look dangerous until they're already out of control. The early stages appear manageable, trivial even. One collision here, one satellite failure there. Nothing systematic, nothing that suggests a crisis. And by the time the pattern becomes undeniable, by the time everyone agrees that action is necessary, the threshold has usually already been crossed. Theory has a way of becoming reality when nobody's paying attention. And in the decades since Kessler published his warning, something changed in orbital space. Something that transformed his theoretical possibility into a practical nightmare. Chapter 2. When Theory Met Reality, January 11th, 2007. A Thursday morning in most of the world, though time zones make precision difficult when discussing events in space. Above China, at an altitude of over 500 miles, something happened that changed orbital space forever. Something that transformed Kessler's theoretical cascade into a documented, measurable reality. The Chinese military launched a ballistic missile from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center in Sichuan province. The facility wasn't secret. It had been used for satellite launches since the 1980s, but this launch was different. Its target wasn't a commercial payload destined for orbit. It wasn't a scientific instrument or a communications satellite. Its target was already in space, had been for years. The missile was a kinetic kill vehicle, designed to destroy its target through sheer impact rather than explosives. It carried no warhead in the conventional sense. It didn't need one. At orbital velocities, mass alone is enough. The kinetic energy of a high-speed collision exceeds any chemical explosive. The target was a Chinese weather satellite called Fengyun 1C. It had been launched in May of 1999, had served its purpose, and had been inactive for years, dead hardware circling uselessly at an altitude where it would remain for decades before natural decay brought it down. The missile struck perfectly. The impact occurred at over 500 miles altitude, in an orbital region crowded with active satellites. The Fengyun satellite, weighing nearly 1,700 pounds, disintegrated. In less than a second, one object became thousands. Metal fragments, electronic components, solar panel pieces, all of it transformed into high-velocity projectiles orbiting at roughly 17,000 miles per hour. The immediate aftermath was tracked by ground-based radar systems across the world. American military installations, part of the Space Surveillance Network, watched the debris cloud expand. Official estimates, published months later after extensive analysis, suggested the impact created more than 3,000 trackable pieces of debris. Trackable meant fragments large enough for ground-based radar to detect and catalogue generally objects larger than about 4 inches in diameter. But that number represented only what could be seen. The actual debris count was far, far higher. Smaller fragments, pieces ranging from paint flecks to fist-sized chunks of metal, numbered in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. These objects were too small to track individually, but still large enough to cause catastrophic damage to any spacecraft unlucky enough to encounter them. At orbital velocities, a pebble hits with the force of a hand grenade. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a malfunction or an unexpected event. It was a deliberate test, a demonstration of capability. China wanted the world to know it had the technology to destroy satellites, to hold orbital infrastructure at risk, to level the playing field in space-based military operations. The strategic implications were immediately clear to anyone paying attention. Space had been militarized since the beginning of the space age. Spy satellites had photographed adversaries since the 1960s. Communication satellites carried military traffic. Navigation systems guided weapons. But actual warfare in space, the physical destruction of spacecraft, had been avoided. It was understood as escalatory, dangerous, potentially catastrophic. The Chinese test broke that taboo. It demonstrated that anti-satellite weapons were operational and effective. It showed that any nation with intermediate-range ballistic missile technology could threaten satellites, and it created a precedent that other nations would inevitably follow. The international response was muted and, in retrospect, completely inadequate. The United States issued diplomatic protests. The State Department called the test irresponsible and dangerous. Other nations expressed concern. There were calls for new treaties governing space weapons, for international cooperation on debris mitigation, for responsible behaviour in orbit. But there were no real consequences, no punishment, no enforceable rules. China had violated no treaty because no treaty existed prohibiting anti-satellite tests. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 banned weapons of mass destruction in orbit, but said nothing about conventional weapons or debris creation. International space law, such as it existed, had no teeth and no enforcement mechanism. And the debris? It's still up there, all of it, moving at over 17,000 miles per hour, spread across multiple orbital planes, creating a permanent hazard zone that will persist for decades. At the altitude of the Fengyun impact, orbital decay is extremely slow. Some fragments will remain in orbit for more than a century. They can't be collected. They can't be removed. They can only be avoided, tracked, and worried about. The debris clouds spread according to orbital mechanics. Fragments in slightly different orbits gradually separated, creating a shell of hazards across the entire orbital plane. Satellites operating at similar altitudes faced new dangers. Collision warnings increased. Avoidance maneuvers became more frequent. The International Space Station, orbiting at a lower altitude but still potentially affected by some of the debris, implemented new procedures for monitoring and responding to threats. This was the moment Kessler's theory stopped being theoretical. The cascade had been triggered, not through negligence or accident, but through deliberate military action. One satellite had been transformed into thousands of fragments. The debris creation rate had jumped dramatically in a single event, and it set a precedent, a template that other nations would follow in the years to come, each adding their own contribution to the growing cloud of orbital hazards. But here's what makes this event particularly significant for our story. The public reaction was surprisingly minimal. Outside of space industry circles and military strategic planning, most people never heard about it. It made news briefly, then disappeared from headlines. Life continued normally. Satellites kept working, GPS kept functioning. The crisis, such as it was, seemed technical and distant, a problem for specialists to manage, and that response, that public indifference, taught governments and space agencies an important lesson. Orbital debris could accumulate dramatically without triggering widespread concern. The danger could grow in plain sight, documented and tracked, without requiring uncomfortable public conversations or expensive mitigation efforts. Silence was acceptable. Business as usual was possible, and the cascade could continue quietly in the darkness above our heads. Chapter 3. The Quiet Accumulation. After the Chinese test, something interesting happened. Something that conspiracy theorists point to as evidence of either profound naivety or calculated strategy. The world didn't pull back from orbital operations, it didn't slow down satellite launches or implement strict debris mitigation rules. Instead, it accelerated. The commercial space industry exploded in the years following 2007. Private companies, funded by billionaire entrepreneurs and venture capital, began launching satellite constellations on a scale previously unimaginable. The barriers to entry dropped dramatically. Launch costs decreased. Satellite manufacturing became more efficient. What had once required government resources and multi-billion-dollar budgets became accessible to private corporations. SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, announced plans for Starlink in late 2015. The concept was ambitious to the point of seeming absurd. A constellation of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit working together to provide global internet coverage. Not hundreds of satellites, thousands. Eventually, if the full plan was realized, tens of thousands. The first Starlink satellites launched in May 2019, 2 prototypes initially, then batches of 60 satellites at a time. The launches came rapidly, sometimes multiple times per month. By the early 2020s, Starlink had become the largest satellite constellation in history, with thousands of active spacecraft and plans to expand far beyond that. Other companies followed the same playbook. OneWeb, a British satellite operator, announced plans for a constellation of hundreds of satellites providing global internet. Amazon unveiled Project Kuiper, planning for over 3,000 satellites. Chinese state enterprises revealed their own mega constellation plans, matching or exceeding Western proposals. The numbers became difficult to comprehend. In the entire history of spaceflight from 1957 through 2000, humanity had launched roughly 5,000 satellites total. Now, single companies were planning to launch that many within a few years. The orbital environment was transforming from a carefully managed domain into something closer to an industrial zone, crowded and chaotic. By the early 2020s, there were more satellites in orbit than at any point in human history. Not hundreds, not a few thousand. The tracking system struggled to maintain accurate counts because the numbers changed daily. Conservative estimates suggested over 10,000 active satellites by 2023, with plans to increase that number by a factor of 10 within the decade. This expansion was celebrated as progress, as technological achievement, as the democratization of space, access to satellite internet in remote areas, global connectivity bridging the digital divide, economic opportunity in orbital operations. The narrative was relentlessly positive, focused on benefits and possibilities rather than risks and consequences. But here's where the conspiracy theory takes hold. Here's where the official story starts to look suspicious to people who pay attention to patterns rather than press releases. What if this normalization of orbital congestion wasn't accidental? What if the rapid commercialization of space, The rush to fill orbital regions with thousands of new satellites served a strategic purpose beyond profit and global connectivity. What if creating a crowded orbital environment provided cover for other activities, made tracking more difficult, and allowed classified operations to hide among civilian infrastructure? Consider the basic problem of space surveillance. Tracking systems can only monitor so many objects with precision. Every new satellite added to the environment increases the computational burden, divides limited attention across more targets, creates more potential conjunctions to evaluate. As the number of objects grows, the quality of tracking necessarily decreases. There's only so much radar time, so much processing capacity, so many analysts to review data. Now imagine you're a military planner, you operate classified satellites, spacecraft whose purposes and capabilities you'd prefer adversaries didn't understand. In a sparse orbital environment, those satellites stand out. Their movements can be tracked, their maneuvers analysed, their purposes inferred through careful observation. But in a crowded environment, one where thousands of commercial satellites are manoeuvring constantly, where new launches happen weekly, where the baseline noise is overwhelming. In that environment, classified operations become much harder to distinguish. A military satellite can manoeuvre and claim it was avoiding debris. Hardware can be deployed and attributed to commercial purposes. Activities that would raise flags in a quiet environment become invisible in the chaos. This provides plausible deniability. It creates strategic ambiguity, and it transforms orbital space from a transparent domain into an opaque one, where adversaries can't be certain what's happening, what's deliberate, what's accidental. So when thousands of new satellites flood into orbit, when commercial constellations expand at unprecedented rates, when the entire orbital environment becomes congested and difficult to monitor, who benefits? Perhaps the companies launching the satellites, certainly. But also the military and intelligence agencies of every spacefaring nation, all of whom operate in an environment where secrecy is easier to maintain and activities are harder to verify. Conspiracy theorists go further. They suggest that some commercial satellite operators may be directly or indirectly working with government agencies, that constellations might serve dual purposes, that the line between civilian and military space operations has blurred to the point of meaninglessness. They point to government contracts, to security clearances held by company executives, to coincidences in launch timing and orbital configurations. Whether these specific claims are true or not, the larger pattern is undeniable. Orbital space has become crowded at exactly the moment when clarity and transparency would be most valuable for managing the debris problem. The congestion that makes Kessler syndrome more likely also makes tracking and accountability more difficult. And perhaps most tellingly, this explosion in satellite numbers happened with relatively little public debate. No environmental review of orbital space, no impact assessment for adding tens of thousands of new objects to a region already struggling with debris. No international treaty limiting constellation sizes or requiring coordination. Just companies announcing plans and governments issuing licenses, and the launches proceeding as fast as rockets could fly. The orbital commons became privatised and crowded in less than a decade, and by the time anyone thought to ask whether this was wise, whether the environmental impact had been considered, whether the long-term consequences outweighed short-term benefits, thousands of satellites were already overhead and thousands more were approved and funded and ready to launch. Congestion became the new normal, and in that environment, accountability became impossible. Chapter 4. The Incidents We Hear About. November 15th, 2021. Early morning in Moscow, late evening in Houston, where Mission Control coordinates operations for the International Space Station. Astronauts aboard the station, representatives from the United States, Russia and other partner nations, received an urgent alert through their communication systems. The message was brief and alarming. Prepare for possible emergency evacuation. Close hatches between modules. Move to the docked spacecraft capable of returning to Earth. A debris event was unfolding, and the space station was potentially in danger. The reason? Russia had just conducted an anti-satellite test, destroying one of its own defunct satellites called Cosmos 1498. The satellite had been launched in 1982, had completed its mission decades earlier, and had been dead hardware drifting in orbit ever since. Now it was fragments, thousands of them, spreading across the orbital plane used by the space station. The weapon used was a DAASAT, a direct-ascent anti-satellite missile launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. Like the Chinese test 14 years earlier, it was a kinetic kill vehicle. Pure impact, no explosives necessary. The collision occurred at an altitude of roughly 300 miles, low enough that the debris would eventually re-enter Earth's atmosphere and burn up, but high enough that the decay would take years or decades. The destruction created over 1,500 pieces of trackable debris according to official estimates. As with the Chinese test, the actual number including smaller fragments was far higher. The debris spread according to orbital mechanics, forming a cloud that intersected with the space station's orbital path multiple times per day. Astronauts remained in their spacecraft for hours, ready to evacuate if debris predictions suggested imminent collision. They wore their launch and entry suits. They reviewed emergency procedures. They waited while ground controllers calculated trajectories and assessed risks. The immediate danger passed. No impacts occurred. The space station survived. But the threat remained. The debris cloud was permanent, or at least as permanent as anything in low Earth orbit. For months afterward, the station performed avoidance maneuvers, using thrusters to adjust its altitude whenever predictions suggested close approaches. The crew maintained heightened awareness, ready to shelter in their spacecraft at short notice. Russian officials described the test as controlled and safe. They insisted there was no danger to the space station or other spacecraft. They characterized it as a routine defensive operation, a demonstration of capability, a response to perceived threats from other nations developing their own anti-satellite systems. International condemnation followed swiftly. The United States called the test reckless and irresponsible. NASA Administrator Bill Nelson issued a statement expressing outrage that Russia would endanger astronauts, including their own cosmonauts aboard the station. Other space agencies worldwide expressed concern. The European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, the Japanese Space Program, all issued statements criticizing the action. But as with the Chinese test, condemnation didn't translate to consequences. Russia faced no sanctions specifically for the debris creation. No international body had authority to punish the action. The Outer Space Treaty remained silent on anti-satellite tests. Space law, such as it existed, had no enforcement mechanism and no penalties. The debris remained, spreading, multiplying the hazard zones, adding to the growing shell of high-velocity fragments encircling the planet. Every piece another potential collision, every fragment another contribution to the cascade that Kessler had warned about decades earlier. Here's what makes this event particularly significant for conspiracy theorists. The response was entirely predictable. Condemnation without consequence, concern without action. Strong words followed by business as usual. The international community expressed outrage at Russia's actions, and then continued their own satellite operations without meaningful change. This pattern raises uncomfortable questions. If the debris problem is as serious as scientists claim, why is the international response so tepid? Why are nations conducting anti-satellite tests despite knowing the consequences? Why does condemnation never translate to enforceable agreements or actual consequences? One explanation is simply geopolitical reality. Space is a strategic domain. Nations compete for advantage. Anti-satellite weapons provide leverage, and no country wants to constrain its own capabilities through treaties that adversaries might violate. But conspiracy theorists propose a darker interpretation. They suggest that the public outrage is performative, that behind closed doors, space agencies and military officials understand that debris creation serves strategic purposes, that the cascade is not something to be prevented but something to be managed and perhaps even weaponized. Think about it from a strategic perspective. Every debris event makes orbital space more dangerous for everyone. It levels the playing field. If you can't match an adversary's satellite capabilities through technology and numbers, you can make those capabilities less reliable through environmental degradation. You create an environment where everyone's hardware is at risk, where no one can maintain clear dominance, where the uncertainty itself becomes a strategic factor, and the public incidents, the tests that make headlines, might represent only a fraction of what's actually happening. Because here's another uncomfortable question. How many similar incidents never reach headlines? How many satellite losses are quietly attributed to technical failures when they're actually collisions? How many military spacecraft are destroyed by debris or anti-satellite weapons in incidents that remain classified? The space station incident became public because you can't hide astronauts sheltering in their spacecraft. You can't classify events that affect crew safety without triggering questions from partner nations. The International Space Station operates as an international collaboration, which means transparency requirements that military satellites don't face. But military satellites, those operate under layers of secrecy. Their orbits are known only approximately, their purposes are classified, their capabilities are never fully disclosed, and when they fail, when they're destroyed, when they disappear from tracking systems, the explanations are minimal and the investigations are secret, so the Russian test that endangered the space station was public because it had to be. But how many other debris-creating events happen in higher orbits, in regions used primarily by military and intelligence satellites, in spaces where transparency doesn't exist and questions aren't asked? We don't know. We can't know. And that uncertainty, that gap in public knowledge, is exactly where conspiracy theories take root and grow. Chapter 5. Classified collisions. Military satellites operate under layers of secrecy. Their orbits are known only approximately. Their purposes are classified. Their capabilities are never fully disclosed. When these satellites fail, the explanations are vague. Anomaly. Technical malfunction. End of operational life. But satellites designed to last 15 years sometimes fail after 3. Spacecraft with redundant systems suddenly stop communicating. Objects that were functioning perfectly go dark without warning. Official channels rarely provide details. The satellite is lost. The investigation is classified. The case is closed. Conspiracy theorists point to specific examples. In 2009, an American commercial satellite called Iridium 33 collided with a defunct Russian military satellite, Cosmos 2251. This collision was confirmed publicly because the Iridium satellite was commercial, its loss immediately noticeable to paying customers. The impact created thousands of debris fragments. It was the first confirmed accidental collision between 2 intact satellites. But here's the question. Was it really the first? Or was it simply the first that couldn't be hidden? Military satellite failures happen regularly. Some are acknowledged in brief official statements, most are not. The hardware simply disappears from tracking systems, noted internally but never explained publicly. The conspiracy theory suggests that many of these losses are actually collisions, that the cascade, effect predicted by Kessler, is already underway, happening slowly, fragment by fragment, in the classified portions of orbital space where public oversight doesn't exist. And if that's true, then we're being told everything is fine while the infrastructure we depend on gradually disintegrates above our heads. Chapter 6. The near misses. Satellites don't stay in fixed positions. They drift. Orbits decay. Unexpected solar activity changes atmospheric drag. Debris from old collisions spreads into new trajectories. To avoid impacts, satellites perform avoidance maneuvers. Thrusters fire. Orbits adjust. The spacecraft moves to a safer altitude or inclination. These maneuvers happen constantly, thousands of times per year. Space operations centers monitor potential conjunctions, moments when 2 objects will pass close enough to pose a collision risk. Operators calculate probabilities, assess dangers, and decide whether to move. Most of these events are never mentioned publicly. They're routine, expected, part of normal operations, but the frequency is increasing. As orbital congestion grows, so do close calls. Satellites that once maneuvered a few times per year now maneuver monthly, sometimes weekly. The operational burden grows with every new launch, every new constellation, every additional fragment. Engineers working in satellite operations quietly admit what public statements don't. The margin for error is shrinking. The buffer zone that once felt comfortable now feels precarious. There are more objects moving faster in an environment that offers no room for mistakes. And here's where it gets unsettling. Maneuvers require fuel. Fuel is finite. Satellites launched with enough propellant for their planned mission lifetime, plus a safety margin. But if avoidance maneuvers become too frequent, that margin disappears. The satellite runs out of fuel years before its planned end of life. What happens then? It becomes a derelict. Another piece of debris. Another hazard for other satellites to avoid. The conspiracy theory suggests this is already happening, that some satellite operators are facing an impossible choice: maneuver constantly and run out of fuel early, or accept higher collision risks and hope for the best. Either way, the problem compounds, and nobody talks about it publicly because admitting the danger would undermine confidence in the entire orbital infrastructure. Chapter 7. The Weaponization Theory. There's a darker interpretation of all this. A theory that the debris problem isn't just a consequence of carelessness or commercial expansion, it's a weapon. Think about it strategically. Nations compete for dominance in space. Satellites provide military advantages, reconnaissance, communication, navigation, early warning systems. Destroying an adversary's satellites would cripple their capabilities, but direct attacks are acts of war. They're provocative. They invite retaliation. They cross lines that even hostile nations hesitate to cross openly. Debris offers something different: plausible deniability. Imagine this scenario. A nation conducts an anti-satellite test, claiming it's for peaceful purposes, a demonstration of defensive capability. The test creates debris. That debris spreads across orbital planes used by adversaries. Satellites begin failing, not immediately, not all at once, slowly, one by one. Each loss explained as a technical failure or micrometeorite impact. No direct attack, no smoking gun, just a gradual degradation of capability that can't be definitively traced back to the original debris event. This is denial strategy. Make orbital space so dangerous that everyone loses access equally. Level the technological playing field by poisoning the commons. If you can't dominate space, make it unusable for everyone. Conspiracy theorists point to the timing of anti-satellite tests. China in 2007, Russia in 2021. These weren't accidents. They were messages, demonstrations that orbital space can be weaponized through debris creation, and that the damage can be spread across years and attributed to 100 different causes. And the response from other nations? Public condemnation, and then their own satellite launches continue. Their own classified programs expand. The cycle perpetuates. If this theory is correct, then the cascade isn't a disaster we're trying to prevent. It's a strategy we're pretending doesn't exist. Chapter 8. Why panic must be avoided. Here's a truth that space agencies and governments understand. Public perception matters more than public safety. Let me explain what I mean. Modern society depends entirely on satellite technology. GPS guides navigation systems. Weather satellites warn of approaching storms. Communication satellites carry internet traffic. Financial networks use satellite links for international transactions. Emergency services rely on satellite coordination. All of this works because people trust it. They don't think about it. They assume the technology functions reliably because it always has. Now imagine what happens if that trust breaks. If people become aware that orbital space is filling with debris, that collisions are increasing, that the entire satellite infrastructure might fail catastrophically within their lifetime. GPS navigation becomes suspect. People start doubting weather forecasts. International commerce faces uncertainty. Markets react to perceived risks. Investment in satellite-dependent technology declines. The entire economic and social framework built on orbital infrastructure begins to crack. And here's the critical part. The technology itself might still be functioning. The danger might still be years or decades away. But public fear creates immediate consequences. Economic disruption, political pressure, demands for expensive solutions to problems that can't be solved quickly. From a government perspective, this is a worst-case scenario. You get all the damage of a crisis without the actual crisis occurring yet. You undermine the system while it's still working, creating the very collapse you are trying to prevent. So what's the alternative? Silence, careful management of information, acknowledgement of concerns in technical forums while maintaining public confidence through reassuring statements. Let the experts handle it quietly. Keep the population unaware until solutions are in place. Conspiracy theorists argue this is exactly what's happening, that space agencies and governments have decided that public awareness of the debris problem would cause more damage than the problem itself. That stability depends on keeping people ignorant of the danger accumulating above them, and if that's true, then every official statement about space safety needs to be read as public relations rather than public information. Chapter 9. The Threshold Question. There's a mathematical concept in systems theory called a tipping point. It's the moment when a gradual change becomes irreversible, when a process that was building slowly suddenly accelerates beyond control. Climate scientists talk about tipping points in ice sheet melting. Ecologists discuss them in relation to ecosystem collapse, and orbital debris experts debate whether such a point exists for Kessler syndrome. The question is deceptively simple. Is there a specific density of objects in orbit beyond which cascading collisions become inevitable? A threshold we can measure and avoid crossing? Some scientists argue yes. They propose models suggesting that certain orbital regions are approaching critical density. They advocate for active debris removal, stricter launch licensing, mandatory deorbiting systems. They warn that without intervention, the cascade will begin within decades. Other scientists are more cautious. They point out that orbital space is vast, that collision probabilities are still relatively low, that technology improvements might outpace debris accumulation. They suggest the risk is manageable with appropriate regulation. But here's where conspiracy theory enters the picture. What if we've already crossed the threshold? What if the tipping point is in the past, and we're now watching the slow-motion cascade unfold? Think about what that would mean. The collisions we know about, the ones publicly acknowledged, might just be the visible portion of a much larger process. The debris creation rate might already exceed our ability to track it. The cascade might be happening in orbital regions we can't monitor effectively, among satellite populations we're not told about. And the silence from official channels wouldn't be about preventing panic. It would be about managing an irreversible disaster that's already underway. This version of the theory suggests that space agencies understand the situation perfectly. They know the cascade has begun. They know it can't be stopped. And they've decided that gradual managed decline of orbital infrastructure is preferable to sudden public awareness and the chaos that would follow. In this scenario, every new satellite launch is understood as temporary. Every orbital operation is conducted with the knowledge that its lifespan is limited not by technology, but by the growing debris field. The space age is ending, and we're living through its final decades without being told. Is this plausible? The mathematics suggests it's possible. The secrecy around military satellites makes it unverifiable, and the continued expansion of commercial satellite operations could be interpreted either as confidence that the danger is manageable, or as a rush to extract value from orbital space before it becomes unusable. The truth is, we don't know. And that uncertainty is exactly what conspiracy theories thrive on. Chapter 10. The World After Orbit. Let's engage in a thought experiment. Imagine that the cascade is real, that the threshold has been crossed, and that orbital space is gradually becoming unusable. What would that world look like? It wouldn't be apocalyptic, not in the way disaster movies portray. Civilization wouldn't collapse overnight. The lights wouldn't go out. Society wouldn't descend into chaos. Instead, it would be a slow erosion, a gradual return to capabilities we had decades ago. GPS accuracy would degrade first. Navigation systems would become less reliable. Ships and aircraft would return to backup systems. Delivery routing would become less efficient. The precision we've come to expect would fade. Weather forecasting would suffer next. Satellite imagery provides the foundation for modern meteorology. Without constant orbital observation, prediction windows would shorten. Hurricane tracking would become less accurate. Climate monitoring would lose its global perspective. Communication networks would fragment. Remote areas currently served by satellite internet would lose connectivity. International broadcasting would face limitations. The global instantaneous communication we take for granted would become regional and delayed. Earth observation would decline. Climate science would lose crucial data sources. Environmental monitoring would become patchy and incomplete. Illegal fishing and deforestation would become harder to track. Our understanding of planetary changes would dim. Most importantly, we wouldn't be able to fix it. Launching new satellites would become extremely dangerous, possibly impossible. The debris field would persist for decades or centuries depending on altitude. Orbital space would be off limits to humanity until natural decay eventually cleared the fragments. This wouldn't end technological civilization. We'd adapt. We'd rebuild ground-based systems. We'd invest in alternatives. But we'd lose something profound. The ability to see Earth from above, to communicate globally in real time, to treat the planet as a single, interconnected system. And here's the conspiracy angle. What if preparations for this scenario are already underway? What if governments and major corporations are quietly developing contingency plans, backup systems, alternative technologies that don't depend on satellites? What if the push for ground-based fibre networks, for localised communication systems, for regional rather than global supply chains, is partially motivated by the unspoken understanding that orbital infrastructure is becoming unreliable? What if the future is already being built around the assumption that we're losing the sky? Epilogue. The sky still looks empty. Tonight, step outside and look up. The sky appears unchanged. The same stars that guided ancient navigators still shine. The moon follows its eternal course. Everything seems peaceful, timeless, infinite. But what you don't see matters more than what you do. Above the visible darkness, in the thin shell of space where atmosphere becomes void, thousands of objects circle at impossible speeds, satellites transmitting the data that runs modern life, debris fragments from decades of exploration and conflict, a growing cloud of hazards that no human eye can perceive. If the conspiracy theories are true, this invisible infrastructure is failing. Not catastrophically, not obviously, but incrementally, collision by collision, fragment by fragment, in a cascade that might already be irreversible. And we're not being told because the truth would cause more damage than the lie. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps the danger is real but manageable. Perhaps space agencies are taking appropriate precautions. Perhaps the debris problem is being addressed through technological solutions and international cooperation. Perhaps everything is fine. But consider this. If the danger above us were obvious, if the cascade were visible, if the threat were unmistakable, it would already be too late. The nature of exponential growth is that it appears insignificant until it becomes overwhelming. The characteristic of cascade failures is that they seem impossible right up until they're inevitable. So we trust, we launch satellites, we build constellations, we depend more deeply every year on infrastructure floating in an environment we can't protect and barely understand. And somewhere, in classified briefing rooms and technical conferences, people who know more than we do make decisions about what we should and shouldn't hear, about which risks to acknowledge and which to quietly manage, about whether public awareness serves public interest. Maybe they're right. Maybe the silence is necessary. Maybe knowing would change nothing except our peace of mind. Or maybe we deserve to understand what's happening in the space our civilization depends on. Maybe the orbit we're not allowed to talk about is the one we most need to discuss. The sky still looks empty, but every night invisible to human eyes fragments continue their dance. Satellites maneuver, operators calculate probabilities, engineers monitor close approaches, and the shell of debris grows imperceptibly denser. One day, perhaps soon, perhaps in generations, someone will look up at that same peaceful sky and wonder when we lost it, when the infrastructure failed, when the cascade became undeniable, and they'll ask why no one warned them, why the danger was kept quiet, why the crisis was allowed to build in silence. We might not have a good answer. Only the same excuse authorities have always given when hiding uncomfortable truths. We thought it was for the best. We didn't want to cause panic. We believed we had time. But in the end, what we don't see can hurt us. What we're not told can shape our future. And the space above our heads, invisible and taken for granted, might be the most important place no one's watching. The orbit we're not allowed to talk about continues. The satellites keep launching, the debris keeps accumulating, and the question remains unanswered. Are we being protected by silence, or betrayed by it? Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, know that above you, moving faster than bullets, a cloud of human-made debris circles endlessly. It might be nothing. It might be everything. And the fact that you weren't supposed to think about it might be the most telling detail of all. Sweet dreams. And remember, the sky is always watching, even when we're not watching back. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using those hype points on this video. It genuinely helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to, of course. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It really builds this incredible community of curious minds from every corner of the globe. Also, a massive thank you to Dogface680 for suggesting this topic. Now, let's get into it. The Hynek Files. The scientist who saw too much. Imagine being the person the government calls when they need someone to make the impossible sound ordinary. Imagine spending 3 decades explaining away what you know, deep down, cannot be explained. Imagine carrying secrets so heavy that even on your deathbed you can only hint at the truth. This is the story of J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who became the Air Force's chief UFO debunker, only to become the phenomenon's most credible believer. A man who spent 22 years inside Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program. A man who, by the end of his life, was convinced the government had been hiding the real story all along. And 3 months after giving his final interview, he was dead. The tapes from that interview, gone, vanished from a university archive by someone who never signed in. This is where documented truth becomes stranger than fiction. The last interview, April 1986, Evanston, Illinois. The room is small, cluttered with star charts and aging textbooks. Afternoon light filters through half-closed blinds, casting long shadows across the desk where J. Allen Hynek sits, 75 years old, his face lined with decades of secrets. Across from him, a graduate student adjusts a tape recorder. Her name is Rebecca Marks, though she won't become important to this story until much later. This is supposed to be a simple oral history project for Northwestern University. Nothing more than an elderly professor reflecting on his career in astronomy. Standard academic documentation. But Hynek keeps glancing at the door. The student notices but doesn't comment. She's young, maybe 23, and she's done her research. She knows Hynek spent more than 2 decades as the scientific consultant to the Air Force's UFO investigation programs. She knows about Project Blue Book. She knows about the swamp gas explanation that made him a punchline in 1966. What she doesn't know yet is that this interview will haunt her for the rest of her life. They talk for 90 minutes. Hynek is measured, careful, professional. He discusses stellar classification, his work at Ohio State, the development of satellite tracking systems, all safe territory. His answers are the kind you'd expect from any distinguished astronomer nearing the end of his career. Thoughtful, precise, unremarkable. Rebecca notices his coffee cup. He's barely touched it. His hands rest on the desk, but his fingers keep tapping in a regular rhythm against the wood. Nervous energy from a man who spent his entire career projecting calm authority. Then, as she's packing up the recorder, reaching for the power button, Hinek speaks again. His voice is different now, quieter, urgent, almost a whisper. History will remember Project Blue Book as an investigation, he says, but it was really a filter. The real cases never reached the public. Rebecca's hand freezes over the recorder. She looks at him. What do you mean, the real cases? Hynek's hands are shaking slightly. He's staring at something beyond her, beyond the room, as if seeing through the walls into some distant memory he's carried for too long. The ones they told me not to classify as unexplained. The ones where the evidence was too clear, too consistent, too troubling. He pauses, and in that silence Rebecca can hear the buildings settle around them. The hum of fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic on Sheridan Road. There were files I could never see, Hinek continues. Reports removed before I arrived. Witnesses told to recount their statements. Photographs that disappeared before analysis. Who told them to recant? Hynek just shakes his head slowly. People who decided what the public could handle. People who understood that some truths destabilize entire systems of belief. Rebecca asks if she can keep recording. Hynek says no, but he keeps talking anyway for another 20 minutes, off the record. She frantically pulls out a notebook and scribbles, trying to capture every word. He mentions cases by location and date, incidents she's never heard of. A radar tracking event over Montana in 1953 involving multiple installations. Visual confirmations by commercial pilots over the Great Lakes in 1961. Objects tracked across state lines, moving at speeds that made no aerodynamic sense. Physical evidence, burned soil, electromagnetic interference, radiation signatures that disappeared into classified channels before civilian scientists could examine it. Why didn't you say something publicly? She asks, her pen moving rapidly across the page. I tried, Hynek replies, and there's something broken in his voice now. In my way, carefully, I spoke at universities. I wrote papers with coded language. I built networks with other researchers. But there are people who don't want this conversation to happen. Not because they're evil, necessarily. Because they're terrified of what it means. He leans forward, and Rebecca sees something in his eyes she'll remember for the rest of her life. Not fear, exactly. More like the exhaustion of a man who's carried a weight too heavy for too long. Do you know what happens when you tell the public that everything they believe about reality might be incomplete? When you suggest that non-human intelligence has been interacting with us, studying us, for decades? The social structures we've built, religion, science, government authority, they all rest on certain assumptions. You pull one thread. He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't have to. Before she leaves, he tells her one more thing. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. 3 months later, J. Allen Hynek is dead. Heart attack. Nothing suspicious on paper. The obituaries call him a distinguished astronomer and the scientific advisor to Project Blue Book. They mention his later work founding the Center for UFO Studies. They're respectful, brief, forgettable. When Rebecca Marks returns to the university archive 2 weeks later to review the interview tape for her thesis, she's told it's missing. The archive log shows someone checked it out 6 days after Hynek's death. No name, no signature, no ID number, just a checkout date and time, May 3rd, 1986, 2:15 p.m. Rebecca files a complaint. The university apologises, calls it an administrative error. The tape is never found. She asks to see security footage from the archive reading room. She's told the system was malfunctioning that week. She contacts the campus police. They file a report and nothing happens. Years later, after she's completed her PhD and moved into a career in science journalism, Rebecca will occasionally Google J. Allen Hynek's name. She'll read the conspiracy forums, the UFO research sites, the academic papers analysing Project Blue Book's methodology, and she'll wonder if Hynek knew his time was running out, if that interview was his last attempt to leave breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow them, if he suspected someone was listening, watching, waiting for him to say too much. She still has her handwritten notes from those 20 minutes after the recording stopped. She keeps them in a safe deposit box. She's never published them. She's not sure she ever will. But sometimes, late at night, she takes them out and reads them again, and she thinks about what Hynek said. The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. The public history versus the secret history. To understand what Hynek knew and why it terrified him, you have to understand who he was before the Air Force recruited him. Joseph Allen Hynek was born May 1st, 1915 in Chicago, son of Czech immigrants who'd fled Europe seeking opportunity and stability. His father worked in a cigar factory. His mother took in sewing. They were working-class people who valued education above everything else. From childhood, Hynek was obsessed with the stars. He'd spend hours on the roof of their apartment building with a homemade telescope, charting constellations, tracking planets. His parents couldn't afford books, so he haunted the public library, devouring everything he could find about astronomy, physics, mathematics. He was brilliant. Everyone knew it. Teachers, neighbours, family friends. By age 12, he was doing university-level mathematics. By 15, he taught himself calculus. He earned a scholarship to the University of Chicago, then completed his doctorate in astrophysics by age 24. His dissertation on stellar spectroscopy, the analysis of starlight to determine a star's composition and characteristics, was considered groundbreaking work. By 1940, he'd secured a faculty position at Ohio State University. By all accounts, he was living the dream. A kid from a working-class immigrant family who'd become a respected scientist. In the academic world, Hynek was known as meticulous, skeptical, grounded in observable data. He had no patience for speculation or pseudoscience. He believed the universe could be understood through measurement, mathematics, and careful observation. He did not believe in flying saucers. When the UFO phenomenon exploded across America in the late 1940s, after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier in June 1947, after the Roswell incident weeks later, after hundreds of reports began flooding military installations, Hynek thought it was mass hysteria. Post-war anxiety manifesting as delusion. People seeing aircraft and planets and making them into something alien. He said as much in faculty meetings. He wrote dismissive letters to colleagues who took the subject seriously. He considered the whole thing beneath serious scientific inquiry, which is exactly why the Air Force wanted him. 1948. The United States military is hemorrhaging credibility over UFO reports. Pilots, combat veterans with thousands of flight hours, are seeing objects that outperform any known aircraft. Radar operators are tracking things moving at speeds that should tear apart any physical object. The public is fascinated and increasingly convinced the government is hiding something. The Air Force needs someone with impeccable scientific credentials to calm things down. Someone who can look at the data and confidently say, weather balloons, temperature inversions, atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, optical illusions. Someone who doesn't believe in flying saucers. J. Allen Hynek seemed perfect for the job. He's recruited into Project Sign, the Air Force's first official UFO study, in late 1948. The initial contact comes through official channels, a letter on Air Force letterhead, signed by a general Hynek has never heard of. Would he be interested in consulting on a scientific matter related to aerial phenomena? Compensation provided. Minimal time commitment. Purely advisory role. Hynek is intrigued, and honestly, a little amused. He sees it as an opportunity to apply real science to a question that's become hopelessly muddied by speculation and sensationalism. His job is simple: review sighting reports and provide scientific explanations, and at first that's exactly what he does. A pilot reports seeing a disc-shaped object. Hynek explains it's likely a lenticular cloud formation, which can appear metallic in certain lighting conditions. Radar picks up an unidentified blip. Temperature inversion, he says. Under certain atmospheric conditions, radar waves can bounce off warm air layers, creating false returns. Multiple witnesses see strange lights. Venus, he explains patiently. At certain times of year, Venus appears exceptionally bright and can seem to move due to atmospheric distortion and the observer's own motion. He explains away lights in the sky as Venus, Jupiter, meteors, balloons, experimental aircraft, strange radar blips as temperature anomalies, equipment malfunctions, birds flocking in formation. Pilot reports as optical illusions caused by fatigue, reflected starlight, or misidentified conventional aircraft. Publicly, he tells the press, most UFO sightings can be explained by natural phenomena or misidentification. When you apply rigorous scientific analysis, the mystery disappears. The Air Force loves him. The press quotes him. Skeptics cite him. He becomes known as the scientific voice of reason in a field dominated by speculation. Internally, though, something begins to shift, because some cases don't fit the script. There are reports where Venus can't be the answer because Venus wasn't visible in that part of the sky at that time, where temperature inversions can't explain radar returns, because the atmospheric conditions were documented and stable, where pilot testimony is too detailed, too specific, too consistent with physical evidence on the ground. Hynek starts keeping two sets of notes. The official reports he submits to the Air Force, carefully worded to provide conventional explanations, and his personal observations filed away in notebooks he keeps locked in his office. In those personal notes, a pattern begins to emerge. A growing sense that he's not investigating a phenomenon, he's managing one. Project Grudge and the first red flags. By 1951, Project Sign has been quietly restructured into Project Grudge. The name change isn't subtle, and that's the point. Grudge was chosen deliberately. It reflected the Air Force's official stance that UFO reports were a nuisance, a distraction from real national security concerns like the Soviet threat and the Korean War. The mission was no longer investigation, it was dismissal. Hynek noticed the change immediately. The tone of the briefing shifted. The types of cases sent to him changed. Suddenly the most intriguing reports, the ones with multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, weren't reaching his desk anymore. Instead, he received obvious misidentifications, hoaxes, reports that were easy to debunk, cases designed to make the entire phenomenon look foolish. When he asked about the more credible cases he'd heard about through military channels, he was told they were being handled by other departments, national security concerns, need-to-know basis. He started keeping more detailed personal notes, fragments that would later surface in his private papers, giving researchers a glimpse into his growing disillusionment. One entry, dated September 1951, received truncated report on Utah sighting. Multiple witnesses, including commercial pilot and ground observers. Witness claimed the object descended vertically at high speed, hovered approximately 200 feet above desert floor for estimated 45 seconds, then accelerated horizontally, disappearing from view in under 3 seconds. Radar confirmation mentioned in initial summary but absent from final report sent to me. When I requested full radar logs, told they were unavailable due to equipment malfunction. 3 different radar stations experienced simultaneous equipment malfunction. The statistical probability approaches 0. Hynek was starting to see a pattern. The most compelling evidence was being filtered out before it could reach him. He began making inquiries through unofficial channels, conversations with radar technicians at air traffic control centres, informal discussions with pilots he knew from his work at Ohio State. What he heard troubled him deeply. The cases were real. The radar data existed. The photographs were clear. But somewhere between the initial report and official investigation, crucial details were disappearing. And then something stranger happened, something that convinced Hynek he was under surveillance. He wrote a letter to a colleague at another university, an astronomer named Thomas Gillespie, who he'd known since graduate school. The letter was carefully worded, but it asked a pointed question. Have you noticed institutional resistance to objective UFO study? I'm finding it increasingly difficult to access primary source data. Hynek mailed the letter from the campus post office on a Tuesday morning. He remembered because he had a faculty meeting immediately afterward. The letter never arrived. 2 weeks later, Hynek called Gillespie to follow up. Gillespie said he'd received no letter. Hynek contacted the postal service. They had no record of it being lost or returned. It had been properly stamped, properly addressed. It simply vanished somewhere between the Columbus post office and Berkeley, California. One lost letter might be coincidence. But Hynek had mailed other correspondence that same day. Personal letters to family, a note to a colleague about an upcoming conference. All of those arrived without issue. Just the letter about UFOs disappeared. Hynek wrote in his journal that night, "The phenomenon is not being studied, it is being buried, and I suspect anyone asking too many questions is being watched." That's when he began to suspect he wasn't working for an investigation. He was working for a containment operation, and his role wasn't to find the truth, it was to provide plausible deniability. He considered resigning, but he realised that leaving would mean losing any access he had, however limited. At least inside the program he could see some of the data. He could document the inconsistencies. He could perhaps slowly build a case for the phenomenon's legitimacy. So he stayed. But he stopped trusting his employers, and he started preparing for the possibility that someday someone would need to know what he'd witnessed. Project Blue Book and 22 years of controlled access. 1952, Project Grudge becomes Project Blue Book, a name chosen to sound official, scientific, comprehensive. The rebranding was deliberate. The Air Force needed to convince the public and Congress that they were taking the UFO question seriously. Project Blue Book was given more resources, better staffing, improved investigative protocols. On paper, it looked like a legitimate scientific endeavour. To the public, Blue Book represented the government's good faith effort to understand the UFO phenomenon. It had scientists, standardised reporting forms, investigative teams dispatched to interview witnesses. It published annual reports. It looked legitimate. J. Allen Hynek was appointed Chief Scientific Consultant. His name lent credibility. His presence suggested serious scientific inquiry. For the next 22 years, from 1952 to 1969, he would review thousands of cases. Officially, Blue Book investigated 12,618 UFO reports during its operational lifetime. Hynek later claimed that number was misleading on multiple levels. Many explainable cases, he said, were exaggerated to make the Air Force look thorough. Simple misidentifications, aircraft lights, bright planets, obvious hoaxes, were written up as detailed investigations to pad the statistics. The message, look how many cases we solve. Meanwhile, many genuinely unexplainable cases were either downgraded, reclassified, or removed from the archive entirely before final publication. The process worked like this. A UFO report would come in through military or civilian channels. An initial investigation would be conducted. Witness interviews, site visits, photographic analysis, radar data collection. If the case was easily explainable, it went straight to Blue Book's official files. If the case was complex or unexplainable, it went somewhere else first. Somewhere Hynek didn't have access to. When, or if, he eventually saw it, crucial details had been removed or altered. Witness statements mentioning structured craft were summarised as unusual light in sky. Radar data confirming visual sightings was classified as equipment anomaly. Photographs showing clear objects were deemed inconclusive or possible lens flare. Multiple independent witnesses were reduced to single. Observer report. Hynek was given edited versions of reality. He began to realise he was seeing a curated version of the phenomenon. The parts someone had decided were safe for him to analyse and publicly explain. He started keeping more extensive personal records. After official investigations, he would quietly contact witnesses directly, conducting informal follow-up interviews. What they told him often contradicted the official reports he'd received. He also began networking with other researchers who were noticing the same patterns, scientists and military personnel who suspected the official investigation was a facade. The cases that broke him. 2 events changed Hynek from skeptic to believer. Both were real, both remain unexplained, and both revealed just how much the Air Force was willing to manipulate the truth. The Lubbock Lights, August 25, 1951, Lubbock, Texas. 4 college professors are sitting in a backyard enjoying the warm evening air and discussing micrometeorites. These aren't random civilians. They're scientists from Texas Tech. A chemist, a physicist, a petroleum engineer, and a geologist. Professional observers trained to document phenomena accurately. At 9:20 p.m, one of them happens to glance up. What the hell is that? A formation of the lights is moving across the sky. Not random lights. A perfect V-shaped pattern, like birds flying in formation, but faster than any bird could fly. The lights are bright, bluish-white, distinct against the night sky. The formation covers the entire visible sky in about 3 seconds. That's an angular velocity that suggests incredible speed, potentially thousands of miles per hour depending on altitude. The professors barely have time to process what they've seen before it's gone. They sit in stunned silence for a moment, then immediately begin comparing observations. What colour were the lights? How many? What was the exact pattern? How fast were they moving? Their accounts match perfectly. 20 to 30 lights, bluish-white, V-shaped formation, silent, moving from north to south. Then, 18 minutes later, it happens again. Same formation, same speed, same trajectory. Over the next 2 weeks, the lights appear multiple times. Dozens of Lubbock residents see them. The local newspaper runs stories. The sightings make national news. On August 30th, a Texas Tech freshman named Carl Hart Jr. photographs them. He sets up his camera in his backyard, and when the lights appear, he captures 5 clear photographs. The images show the V formation exactly as witnesses described, multiple lights in perfect geometric arrangement. The photographs are remarkably clear. Hart brings them to the newspaper, which publishes them on the front page. The images go national. Life magazine runs them. They become some of the most famous UFO photographs of the era. The Air Force dispatches investigators. Hynek reviews the case file, and he cannot explain it. He interviews the professors personally. These are credible witnesses, trained observers with nothing to gain from fabricating a story. Their descriptions are consistent, detailed, and sober. He examines Hart's photographs. They're not hoaxes. Analysis shows no evidence of double exposure or manipulation. The lights are real. Physical objects photographed over multiple frames. He considers conventional explanations. Aircraft? No aircraft flies in that type of formation or at that speed. Meteors? Meteors don't move in perfect geometric patterns or repeat the same trajectory multiple times over 2 weeks. Reflections? Reflections don't appear to multiple witnesses in different locations and don't move consistently across the sky. Hynek writes in his official analysis, the lights exhibited intelligent control. They moved in coordinated formations at speeds inconsistent with known aircraft. The photographic evidence is compelling. Multiple credible witnesses with consistent testimony. I cannot provide a conventional explanation that adequately accounts for all observed phenomena. That report goes up the chain of command. When the official Blue Book conclusion is published, the Lubbock lights are attributed to birds reflecting streetlights. Birds? Hynek is furious. He knows this explanation is absurd. Birds don't fly in perfect V formations at supersonic speeds. Birds don't glow with bluish-white luminescence. Birds don't maintain geometric precision while covering the entire visible sky in 3 seconds. But the case is closed. The Air Force has its explanation, and the press runs with it. The Lubbock lights become a joke. Scientists fooled by birds. Hynek tries to push back. He submits a revised report, arguing that the bird explanation doesn't match the data. His report is rejected. He's told the case is resolved and further analysis is unnecessary. That's when Hynek begins to understand his real role. He's not there to investigate. He's there to provide scientific cover for predetermined conclusions. In his private notes, he writes, "They don't want truth. They want closure. My job is to make the impossible sound ordinary, regardless of evidence." The Lubbock Lights case stays with him for the rest of his life. In later years, after he'd left Blue Book, he would publicly state that the case remained unexplained and that the official explanation was inadequate. But by then, the damage was done. The public believed the case was solved. The Lonnie Zamora incident. If the Lubbock Lights troubled Hynek, the Lonnie Zamora incident shattered his remaining skepticism. April 24th, 1964. Socorro, New Mexico. Late afternoon, just before sunset. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora is pursuing a speeding car south of town when he hears a loud roar and sees flames in the distance. His first thought is that the dynamite shack on the edge of town has exploded. He abandons the traffic stop and drives toward the site. The terrain is rough, rocky arroyos and scrub brush. Zamora follows a dirt road up a small hill, struggling to keep his patrol car under control on the loose gravel. He reaches the top of the hill and looks down into the arroyo below. What he sees makes no sense. There's an object resting on the ground. It's oval-shaped, white, smooth, about the size of a car, but the proportions are wrong, wider than it is tall. It's resting on metallic legs, 4 of them, arranged like landing struts. Beside the object stand 2 figures. They're small, as Zamora later estimates around 4 feet tall. They're wearing what look like white coveralls or jumpsuits, one-piece garments, no visible seams. Their proportions seem slightly off in ways Zamora can't quite articulate. The head-to-body ratio isn't quite right. Their movements are too quick, too smooth. Zamora is about 150 yards away. He can't see their faces clearly, but he can see them moving around the object, apparently working on something. Then one of them notices him. The figures react immediately. They move quickly, not running exactly, but moving with a strange fluidity, back toward the object. One disappears around the far side. The other seems to climb or step into an opening Zamora can't quite see. Seconds later, the roar returns. Deafening. Zamora describes it as similar to jet engines, but deeper, more resonant. The object begins to glow at the bottom, a bluish-orange flame that doesn't look like combustion. Zamora panics. He thinks it's going to explode. He runs back toward his patrol car, stumbling in the rocks, certain he's about to be incinerated. The roar reaches a crescendo. When Zamora risks a look back, the object is airborne. It hovers briefly, maybe 20 feet off the ground, then begins moving. Not with the acceleration curve of normal aircraft. It goes from hovering to high-speed flight almost instantaneously, moving low across the desert terrain, following the contours of the land. Within seconds, it's gone. Complete silence returns. The entire encounter lasted less than 2 minutes. Zamora immediately radios the sheriff's office. "You're not going to believe what I just saw." Sergeant Sam Chavez arrives within minutes. Together, they go back to the site. The evidence is undeniable. 4 distinct depressions in the hard-packed earth where the landing legs rested. The soil is compressed and shows clear patterns consistent with something heavy bearing down. Burn marks on the desert scrub. Several bushes are charred, still smouldering slightly. The burn patterns are strange, focused in specific areas but not spreading the way a normal fire would. The ground where the object had been is disturbed, smooth in a way that doesn't match the surrounding terrain. Chavez radios for backup. More officers arrive. An FBI agent arrives. The Air Force is notified. Within 24 hours, Project Blue Book dispatches an investigator. Within 48 hours, J. Allen Hynek himself arrives in Socorro. Hynek interviews Zamora extensively. He examines the physical evidence. He talks to other officers who responded. He documents everything meticulously, and he believes Zamora completely. Zamora is a respected officer with 12 years of service. No history of exaggeration, mental instability, or attention-seeking behaviour. He's known in the community as reliable, level-headed, professional. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story. In fact, he's embarrassed by the attention. He doesn't like talking about it. He's worried it will affect his career. The physical evidence matches his account perfectly. The landing impressions are real. The burn marks are real. The timeline is documented. His radio communications provide a precise record of when he called in the sighting and when other officers arrived. Hynek spends 2 days in Socorro. He walks the site repeatedly. He measures the landing impressions, he interviews witnesses who saw the object from a distance. He checks astronomical data to rule out any conventional explanation. There is no conventional explanation. This wasn't a balloon. It wasn't a helicopter. It was an experimental military craft. The Air Force checked with White Sands Missile Range and Holloman Air Force Base. Nothing was flying in that area at that time. Hynek writes a classified memo to Blue Book headquarters. This case bothers me deeply. The witness is credible. The evidence is physical and documented. The object described exhibits characteristics beyond any known technology. This may be the most significant case we've encountered. It may be the Roswell of my time. That memo is classified and filed separately from the main Blue Book archive. It never appears in the official reports. Publicly, the case is listed as unidentified, one of the few cases Blue Book couldn't explain away, but the official stance is carefully neutral. We don't know what it was, but there's no evidence it was extraterrestrial. Hynek knows the truth is more complicated. He knows what Zamora saw was real. He knows the object displayed intelligent control and technology far beyond human capability. But he also knows he can't say that publicly without destroying his credibility and his access to future cases. So he does what he's been doing for 16 years. He speaks carefully, hints at the truth, and waits for the day when he might be able to tell the full story. That day never quite comes. The Lonnie Zamora incident remains one of the most credible and well-documented UFO cases in history. Even hardcore skeptics struggle to dismiss it. The witness is too reliable, the evidence too physical, the investigation too thorough. But it also becomes a turning point for Hynek. After Socorro, he can no longer pretend he's dealing with misidentifications and psychological phenomena. Something real is happening. Something that doesn't fit into our understanding of reality. And the people running Project Blue Book know it, which is why they're working so hard to keep cases like this from reaching the public eye. The Unseen Files. Years after Blue Book closed, Air Force Colonel Robert Friend, who served as director of Project Blue Book from 1958 to 1963, began speaking more openly about what the program really was. In a 1998 interview, he confirmed what Hynek had long suspected. Blue Book operated 2 filing systems. One was public. The reports shared with Congress, the media, civilian researchers, and consultants like Hynek. This archive was carefully curated to present UFO reports as primarily explainable, or at least manageable. The other was classified, a parallel archive containing cases the Air Force considered genuinely sensitive. These cases involved military pilots reporting structured craft during active combat or training missions, radar installations at sensitive facilities tracking objects that couldn't be explained as atmospheric phenomena, incidents near nuclear weapons installations, missile silos and strategic air bases, events where physical evidence was collected, material samples, radiation readings, photographic evidence that suggested advanced technology, cases involving multiple military witnesses whose testimony couldn't be easily dismissed. Friend stated in the interview, "There were reports Hynek never saw. Cases that involved national security implications were handled separately. They went to different departments, different channels. Blue Book was the public face. But the serious cases, the ones that really concerned us, those went elsewhere." When the interviewer asked where those cases went, Friend said he didn't know. That information was above his clearance level. Think about that for a moment. The director of Project Blue Book, the military's official UFO investigation program, didn't have access to the most important cases. This explained so much of what Hynek had experienced. It explained why he often felt like he was investigating half stories. Because he was. It explained why witnesses would sometimes tell him details that weren't in the official reports he'd received. Because the reports had been edited before reaching him. It explained why he could never quite build a comprehensive picture of the phenomenon. because the most compelling pieces of the puzzle were systematically removed from his view. Hynek was a prop, a scientific facade to give Blue Book credibility, while the real investigations happened in compartmented programs he'd never even hear about. He suspected this during his years with Blue Book, but confirmation wouldn't come until after his death, when researchers began interviewing former military personnel willing to speak more openly. By then, it was too late for Hynek to say, "I told you so." The switch from debunker to believer. By the mid-1960s, Hynek could no longer reconcile what he was being told to say with what he knew to be true. Internally, he was keeping extensive notes documenting the disconnect between evidence and official conclusions. He was quietly networking with other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He was beginning to speak more carefully at academic conferences, hinting at the limitations of Blue Book's methodology. But he was still publicly defending the program, still explaining away cases, still playing his assigned role. The breaking point came in March 1966, during what became known as the Michigan UFO wave. Between March 14th and March 21st, dozens of people across southeastern Michigan reported seeing strange lights maneuvering over fields, forests, and residential areas. The witnesses included police officers, college students, local officials, housewives, farmers, a complete cross-section of the community. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Witnesses reported seeing glowing objects that moved erratically, changed colour, hovered in place, then accelerated to high speeds. Some described the objects as disc-shaped. Others saw only the lights. On the night of March 20th, more than 50 people, including 12 police officers, witnessed objects maneuvering over a swampy area near Dexter, Michigan. The objects were seen for several hours. Multiple independent witnesses described the same phenomena. The sightings made national news. Michigan was in an uproar. Congressman Gerald Ford, who represented the area and would later become president, demanded a congressional hearing. The Air Force was under enormous pressure to provide answers. They dispatched Hynek to Michigan to investigate and, more importantly, to make the story go away. Hynek arrived in Ann Arbor on March 23rd. He spent 3 days interviewing witnesses, examining the sites, reviewing reports. The evidence troubled him. These weren't obvious misidentifications. The witnesses were credible. Their accounts were detailed and consistent. The duration of the sightings, hours in some cases, ruled out meteors or aircraft. But the Air Force needed an explanation. Now. The press was calling, Congress was watching, the public was demanding answers. On March 25th, Hynek held a press conference. Standing before a room packed with journalists and television cameras, under pressure from his Air Force handlers, he offered an explanation. Swamp gas. He explained that decaying vegetation in marshland can produce marsh gas, primarily methane, which can spontaneously ignite under certain conditions, creating glowing lights that appear to move. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The press erupted in laughter. Reporters shouted questions. "Are you serious? Swamp gas? That's your explanation?" The witnesses felt betrayed. The police officers who'd risked their credibility by reporting what they saw were humiliated. The scientific community was embarrassed for him. Swamp gas creating lights that multiple trained observers watched for hours, moving in coordinated patterns. It was absurd. Within hours, editorial cartoons were mocking him. Headlines declared Air Force blames UFOs on swamp gas. Late-night comedians made jokes. Hynek became a punchline, a government scientist willing to blame anything, no matter how ridiculous, rather than admit the obvious. But what the public didn't know, what wasn't revealed until years later when Hynek's personal papers were examined, was that he had written a very different report before the press conference. In his internal analysis, submitted to Project Blue Book headquarters 3 days before going public, he'd stated, "The objects described by witnesses exhibited controlled, intelligent movement inconsistent with natural phenomena. They maneuvered with flight characteristics beyond human capability, instant acceleration, stationary hovering, coordinated group behaviour." Multiple independent witnesses, including trained observers, provide consistent testimony. Physical evidence includes electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition systems and compass anomalies. Swamp gas does not adequately explain the observed phenomena. This case deserves serious scientific study, not dismissal. That report was rewritten before release. Hynek was told to stick to the swamp gas explanation or resign from Blue Book. He could have resigned. He could have held the press conference and said, "I don't know what these people saw, but it wasn't swamp gas." He could have maintained his scientific integrity, but he stayed. He gave the explanation they demanded. He became the man who blamed UFOs on swamp gas. Why? In private correspondence years later, Hynek tried to explain his reasoning. He still believed he could do more good inside the system than outside it. He thought that by maintaining his position, he could continue documenting cases, building evidence, preparing for a time when the truth might emerge. He also feared what would happen if he spoke out, not just to his career, but to the phenomenon itself. He worried that if he, the chief scientific consultant to Blue Book, publicly stated that UFOs were real and represented unknown technology, the backlash would set serious research back decades. So he swallowed his pride, accepted the humiliation, and continued playing his role. But something inside him broke that day in Michigan. From that point forward, Hynek began quietly reaching out to other scientists who took the phenomenon seriously. He started building a network outside official channels. He began planning for a time when he would no longer be constrained by Air Force protocols. He also began speaking more carefully but more pointedly at academic conferences and in scholarly papers. He never explicitly contradicted Blue Book's conclusions, but he raised methodological concerns. He questioned whether the investigation was designed to find truth or provide reassurance. Those who understood what he was doing, other researchers, sympathetic colleagues, recognized that Hynek was laying groundwork, building a case, preparing to speak more openly when the time was right. Hynek contacts other scientists. In the late 1960s, as Project Blue Book began its slow decline toward closure, Hynek intensified his outreach to researchers outside the military system. He established correspondence with Jacques Vallée, a French-American computer scientist who was taking a more rigorous data-driven approach to UFO research. Vallée wasn't interested in sensationalism or speculation. He wanted patterns, statistical analysis, cross-cultural comparison. Hynek and Vallée exchanged hundreds of letters over the years. In those letters, carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, Hynek hinted at the frustrations of working within Blue Book. In a 1967 letter, Hynek wrote, "There are cases the Air Force will not let me classify as unexplained, though they clearly are. I receive reports that have been sanitized, edited, stripped of their most compelling details. It's like trying to study a phenomenon through a filter designed to make it invisible." Vallée later claimed that Hynek believed a hidden intelligence unit was operating within the Air Force, a group tasked with managing UFO incidents in ways that bypassed Blue Book entirely. This wasn't paranoia. Hynek had seen evidence of parallel investigations, cases referenced in internal memos that never appeared in official files, witnesses who mentioned talking to other Air Force investigators, who Hynek never met. Hynek also communicated with James McDonald, an atmospheric physicist from the University of Arizona, who became one of the most vocal scientific critics of Project Blue Book. McDonald was everything Hynek couldn't be: bold, confrontational, willing to publicly challenge the Air Force's conclusions. He testified before Congress, accusing Blue Book of incompetence and deliberate obfuscation. He published papers arguing that UFOs represented a genuine scientific mystery deserving serious study. The Air Force hated McDonald. They viewed him as a threat. They worked behind the scenes to undermine his credibility, questioning his professional judgment, suggesting his UFO research was affecting his scientific work. Hynek admired McDonald's courage, but couldn't publicly align with him. Doing so would have ended his access to Blue Book and eliminated any influence he had on official investigations. Instead, Hynek supported McDonald privately. He shared data. He confirmed inconsistencies in official reports. He validated McDonald's criticisms while maintaining public neutrality. It was a delicate balance, staying inside the system while supporting those trying to expose its failures. Hynek also exchanged letters with Alan Sandage, one of the world's leading astronomers and Hynek's former colleague from Ohio State. Sandage was skeptical of UFOs but respected Hynek's integrity. In one letter, dated June 1968, Hynek wrote something remarkably candid. "Alan, I no longer believe we are dealing with misidentifications or psychological phenomena. After 20 years of reviewing these cases, I'm convinced something real is interacting with us. The question is not whether the phenomenon exists. It does. The question is, what is it? And why is the government so determined to prevent serious scientific study?" Sandage's response was cautious but supportive. He encouraged Hynek to document everything, to prepare for a time when he could speak more freely. He also warned Hynek to be careful, to avoid saying anything that might give his critics ammunition to destroy his reputation. Through these relationships, Hynek began building what would eventually become a post-Blue Book research network. He was preparing for the day when the official investigation ended and the real work could begin. Blue Book closes, but the questions remain. December 17, 1969. The Air Force officially shuts down Project Blue Book. The decision is based on the Condon Report, a study conducted by the University of Colorado and led by physicist Edward Condon. After 2 years of investigation, Condon concludes, "No evidence that UFOs represent extraterrestrial craft. No evidence that UFOs pose a threat to national security. No scientific value in continued study. The report recommends terminating Blue Book and discontinuing official UFO investigations." The Air Force is thrilled. They've wanted to exit the UFO business for years. The program is a public relations nightmare, a budget drain, a constant source of congressional questions. With Condon's academic blessing, they can finally shut it down. At a press conference, Air Force officials announce Blue Book's closure with barely concealed relief. The official statement is brief. "After 22 years of investigation, we have found no evidence that UFOs represent a threat, or that they are vehicles from other worlds. The matter is now considered closed." Hynek attends the press conference. He says nothing. Later, in interviews with mainstream media, he carefully endorses the closure. He tells reporters that most UFO cases can be explained, that the public's fears are unwarranted. The Air Force made a good faith effort to study the phenomenon. He plays his role one last time. But privately, to fellow researchers and in letters to trusted colleagues, Hynek says something very different. Blue Book was the storefront. The real research continued elsewhere. He explains his theory. The Air Force never stopped investigating UFOs. They simply stopped doing it publicly. The cases that really mattered, the ones involving military encounters, radar confirmations, physical evidence, were never part of Blue Book anyway. They were handled through compartmented programs with higher classification levels. Shutting down Blue Book wasn't about ending UFO research. It was about ending public scrutiny. Think about the logic. If UFOs were genuinely unimportant, why investigate them at all? But if they were genuinely important, if they represented unknown technology or potential threats, would you really conduct that investigation in a public program that published annual reports and answered congressional inquiries? Of course not. You'd create a public program that appeared to investigate while the real work happened in the shadows. Hynek believed Blue Book was always meant to fail. Its purpose was to absorb public attention and criticism while protecting the actual investigations from exposure. After Blue Book closed, Hynek was finally free to speak more openly. In 1973, he founded the Center for UFO Studies, creating an independent civilian database of sightings. He began giving lectures at universities, speaking more candidly about Blue Book's limitations and the cases that troubled him. He published a book, The UFO Experience, in which he developed a classification system for UFO encounters and argued that the phenomenon deserved serious scientific study. He was no longer the government's debunker. He was the phenomenon's most credible advocate, and he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the truth was far stranger and more complex than anyone publicly acknowledged. The missing Hynek files. When J. Allen Hynek died on April 27, 1986, researchers and archivists at the Center for UFO Studies immediately began the process of cataloguing his personal papers. They expected a treasure trove of documentation. Hynek had been meticulous about record-keeping throughout his career. They knew he maintained extensive personal files separate from his official work. Notes, correspondence, case analyses, witness interviews, classified memos he'd managed to copy before returning them. The archive would be invaluable. Decades of first-hand observations from the man who'd been inside Project Blue Book for 22 years. Evidence of the cases they'd never published. Proof of the filtering and manipulation he'd witnessed. What they found was incomplete. Several critical categories of material were missing entirely. His personal notes on the Lonnie Zamora case, gone. These weren't official Blue Book files. These were Hynek's private observations, his interviews with Zamora conducted years after the incident, his analysis of why the case remained unexplainable. He'd referenced these notes in correspondence as recently as 1985. His private Blue Book diary, gone. Hynek had kept a personal journal throughout the 1960s, documenting his daily experiences inside Blue Book. Not the sanitized official reports, but his real thoughts, his frustrations, his observations about how cases were manipulated. He'd shown portions of this diary to close colleagues. It was several hundred pages long, an entire folder labelled 1965 Northeast Radar Incidents. Gone. This folder contained documentation of multiple radar trackings of unknown objects over the northeastern United States during a concentrated period in 1965. These cases never made it into Blue Book's official reports. Hynek had been collecting data independently, building a case that the phenomenon was real and being deliberately ignored. His correspondence with Air Force intelligence officers between 1958 and 1964, gone. Hynek had maintained relationships with several intelligence officers who'd worked adjacent to Blue Book. Some of them had provided him with information about cases handled outside official channels. Their letters were candid, sometimes shockingly so, about the reality of what was happening. A box of witness interviews on audio cassette, gone. In the 1970s and early 80s, Hynek had revisited some of the most significant Blue Book cases, conducting new interviews with witnesses now willing to speak more freely. These recordings contained details that had never been made public. Hynek's family was adamant. The files had been in his office shortly before his death. His wife remembered seeing them when she'd helped him organise his study 3 weeks before he died. His son remembered his father mentioning the Lonnie Zamora notes, specifically in a conversation just days before the heart attack. But within a week of Hynek's death, between the funeral and when the archivists arrived to begin cataloguing, the files disappeared. The family filed inquiries. They contacted the Center for UFO Studies. They reached out to former colleagues, asking if Hynek had loaned materials to anyone. No one had taken the files, or if they had, they weren't admitting it. Mark Roediger, who became the scientific director of the Center for UFO Studies, later said, "It felt like someone had surgically removed the most sensitive material. Not everything, just the pieces that would have been most damaging if made public. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were looking for." The official explanation was that Hynek had likely misplaced or destroyed the documents himself in his final years. Perhaps his health had been declining. Perhaps he'd been disorganized. But people who knew Hynek found that impossible to believe. Even in his 70s, he remained sharp, organized, obsessive about documentation. He'd spent 30 years building his archive. He'd talked about it as his legacy, the evidence he'd accumulated for future researchers. Why would he destroy it? And if he'd merely misplaced it, why specifically those files? Why not a random scattering of material? Why precisely the documents that contained the most sensitive information? The alternative explanation, that someone removed the files deliberately, raised darker questions. Who had access to Hynek's home in the days after his death? Who knew what was in his archive and which pieces were most damaging? Who had the motivation to ensure those specific documents never became public? Those questions remain unanswered, but the disappearance of the files became part of Hynek's story. One more suggestion that his suspicions about surveillance and suppression weren't paranoia. The hypothesis Hynek never published in the fragments that remained of Hynek's personal archive, researchers found hints of a theory he'd been developing in his final years, a hypothesis that went far beyond simple aliens from another planet. Based on his notes, private correspondence and conversations recalled by close colleagues, Hynek believed the UFO phenomenon was non-human in origin. Not human technology, not misidentification, not psychological phenomena. Something genuinely other. Technologically superior to anything humans had developed. The flight characteristics alone, instant acceleration, right-angle turns at high speeds, apparent disregard for inertia, suggested technology centuries or millennia ahead of us, intentionally masking itself. The phenomenon appeared in ways that made it difficult to study or prove. It avoided clear, unambiguous encounters. It left just enough evidence to suggest something real, while providing skeptics with plausible deniability. As if it wanted to be seen but not confirmed. Possibly interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. This was Hynek's most radical conclusion. He'd grown skeptical of the simple, visitors from another planet explanation. The objects didn't behave like scouts or explorers. They didn't follow patterns consistent with scientific observation or resource gathering. They appeared and disappeared in ways that seemed to violate physics, not because they broke physical laws, but because they were using those laws in ways we didn't yet comprehend. In a letter to Jacques Vallée dated November 1983, Hynek wrote, "I increasingly suspect we're dealing with something that exists in a relationship to our reality that we don't have the conceptual framework to understand. These objects don't travel through space in the conventional sense. They don't seem to come from anywhere and go anywhere. They manifest, they appear, and then they're gone, as if our three-dimensional space is just one layer of a more complex structure." He elaborated on this in a 1985 paper presented to a small group of physicists and theorists. Physical laws are not violated. They are used in ways we do not yet grasp. What appears impossible, instantaneous acceleration, dematerialization, apparent defiance of gravity, may simply reflect our incomplete understanding of physics. Just as quantum mechanics revealed layers of reality invisible to classical physics, perhaps the UFO phenomenon operates in dimensions or states of being we haven't yet discovered. This was radical thinking. It suggested the phenomenon wasn't just advanced technology. It was something far more complex, possibly involving dimensions or realities beyond our current scientific framework. It also explained some of the pattern Hynek had observed over 3 decades. Why the phenomenon never provided clear, unambiguous proof of its existence. Why it seemed to adapt to human perception, appearing in ways that fit cultural expectations. Airships in the 1890s, rockets in the 1940s, sleek saucers in the 50s. Why witness accounts were often surreal, dreamlike, filled with absurd details that made them easy to dismiss, as if the phenomenon was operating in a space where the normal rules of physical reality were more fluid. Why scientific study seemed to make it recede, as if observation itself affected the phenomenon. Hynek never published this hypothesis. He discussed it only with close colleagues, and even then carefully. He knew how it would sound. He knew it would destroy whatever mainstream credibility he had left. The scientific community barely tolerated his advocacy for UFO research as potential extraterrestrial visitation. If he started talking about interdimensional phenomena and reality structures beyond our understanding, he'd be dismissed as a crank. So he kept it private, sharing only with those he trusted to understand the distinction between speculative theory and ungrounded fantasy. But in his final years, he became increasingly convinced this was the right direction. The phenomenon was real, but it was stranger than simple aliens from another planet. It was something that challenged our fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Hynek's final warning. In the weeks before his death, Hynek gave a series of informal talks to small groups of researchers, private gatherings, not publicised, attended by people who had been following the phenomenon for decades. One attendee, a physicist who'd known Hynek since the 1970s, later recounted a conversation that took place at a Chicago restaurant in March 1986, just weeks before Hynek's death. Hynek was reflective that night, almost melancholy. He talked about his years with Blue Book, the cases that still troubled him, the pattern of suppression he'd witnessed. Then he said something the physicist would never forget. The Air Force knew the truth far earlier than they will admit. I'm certain of it now. They had cases in the late 40s and early 50s that were absolutely clear. Multiple witnesses, radar confirmation, physical evidence, cases that couldn't be explained away, and they made a decision. The truth was too destabilizing to reveal. The physicist asked what he meant by destabilizing. Hynek explained, "If you tell people that non-human intelligence is interacting with us, that our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete, that the government has been lying for decades, what happens? Religious institutions face challenges to their cosmology. Scientific paradigms crumble. Public trust in government evaporates. Social stability depends on shared assumptions about reality. Pull one thread, and the entire fabric might unravel. They chose containment over disclosure." "Do you think that was the right choice?" someone asked. Hynek was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I don't know. Maybe they genuinely believed they were protecting people from information they weren't ready to handle. Maybe they were right to be cautious, but I think they underestimated humanity. I think people are more resilient than the gatekeepers give them credit for. And I think the cost of secrecy, the cost of allowing this phenomenon to remain unexamined by the full scope of human science, that cost might be higher than the risk of disclosure." Another researcher asked if Hynek thought disclosure would ever happen. "I used to think it would come gradually," Hynek replied. "Slow revelation, careful management. But I'm not sure anymore. The secrecy has gone on so long, the compartmentalization runs so deep, I'm not sure the people currently in charge even know the full picture. The information is scattered across agencies that don't communicate. The institutional memory is fragmented. We might have reached a point where the truth can't be disclosed because no one person or organisation has access to all of it." This was a chilling idea, that the cover-up had become so complex, so bureaucratically distributed, that it had transcended any individual or agency's control. The secrecy had become self-perpetuating, maintaining itself through sheer organisational inertia. Before they left the restaurant that night, Hynek said one more thing. "I've documented what I could. I've left a record. Maybe someday, when the time is right, someone will be able to piece together the full picture. All I can do is leave breadcrumbs and hope someone follows them." 5 weeks later, he was dead. Operation Sentinel. One of the most intriguing and unverified claims about Hynek's final years involves a program allegedly called Operation Sentinel. According to Jerome Davis, a researcher who claims to have spoken with Hynek at a conference in September 1985, Hynek mentioned a classified monitoring program that allegedly continued UFO surveillance after Blue Book ended. Davis's account, published years later in a UFO research journal, describes a conversation where Hynek seemed unusually candid. Perhaps because he was among colleagues, perhaps because he was growing weary of maintaining secrecy. Hynek allegedly said, "Blue Book ended, but the work didn't. There's a program, I don't know what it's officially called, but I've heard it referred to as Sentinel. It's joint CIA and Air Force, with cooperation from NASA and possibly other agencies. It uses advanced surveillance technology that didn't exist when Blue Book was operating." He described what Sentinel allegedly involved: reconnaissance satellites specifically tasked with tracking objects entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. Not the general surveillance satellites everyone knows about, but specialized systems designed to detect unconventional propulsion signatures and anomalous trajectories. Radar triangulation networks across the continental United States, positioned to provide overlapping coverage and immediate notification when objects moving at unconventional speeds or exhibiting unusual flight characteristics are detected. International reporting systems coordinated with allied nations, Britain, Canada, Australia, potentially others. A data sharing network that allows for tracking of objects across national boundaries. Automated analysis systems using computer algorithms to filter reports and identify patterns, something that wasn't technologically feasible during Blue Book's operation, but became possible in the 70s and 80s. According to Davis, Hynek claimed he'd heard about Sentinel from a former intelligence officer who'd reached out to him in the late 1970s. The officer was dying of cancer and wanted to unburden himself before the end. They met at a hotel near O'Hare Airport. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The officer, Hynek never revealed his name, described an operation that had been running since the early 70s shortly after Blue Book's closure. Blue Book was a public relations operation, the officer allegedly told Hynek. Sentinel was the real program. We kept tracking, we kept analysing, we kept investigating. We just stopped telling anyone about it. When Hynek asked why the secrecy was maintained, the officer supposedly replied, "Because the phenomenon never stopped. The sightings continued, the radar trackings continued, and we still don't understand what we're dealing with. But admitting that publicly, after spending 20 years telling everyone there's nothing to worry about, that would be career suicide for everyone involved. There is no official record of Operation Sentinel. No documents have surfaced. No whistleblower has provided corroborating testimony. No budget lines in declassified Air Force spending show a program by that name. But the idea fits perfectly with the pattern Hynek had observed for decades, a public facade covering a secret reality. If Sentinel existed, it would explain several things. Why the Air Force was so comfortable shutting down Blue Book. They didn't need public legitimacy anymore. They could monitor the phenomenon privately, without congressional oversight or media scrutiny. Why credible sighting reports continued to come from military pilots and radar installations after 1969, but no official investigation was conducted. The investigation was happening, just not publicly. Why Hynek remained convinced that the government knew more than it was revealing? Because they did. The investigation never stopped. Some researchers dismiss the Sentinel story as unverifiable rumour. Others point out that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when dealing with classified programs. What's notable is that Hynek, a cautious, methodical scientist, found the story credible enough to mention it to colleagues. He wasn't prone to repeating unverified claims. If he talked about Sentinel, he believed there was something to it. Whether that program existed under that name or something like it existed under a different designation, the central claim seems almost certainly true. The United States government didn't stop investigating UFOs when Blue Book closed. They just stopped doing it in public view. Hynek's legacy. The man who tried to tell us softly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Hynek began slipping information into public speeches and academic presentations. He'd give a talk about the history of Project Blue Book and then casually mention, there were cases involving objects tracked on radar that Blue Book never officially logged. The data exists, but it was classified at the time and remains so today. Or he'd discuss the methodology of UFO investigation and note, cases involving multiple military witnesses and physical evidence often bypassed Blue Book entirely. They were handled through different channels. I wasn't given access to them. Or he'd talk about the Lonnie Zamora incident and add, I wrote extensive analysis concluding this was a genuine unknown. That analysis was classified. The public version of my conclusions was simplified. He never made explicit accusations. He never named specific agencies or individuals. He never violated his security clearances or revealed classified information. But for those paying attention, researchers who understood the implications, the message was clear. The official story was incomplete. The truth was far more complex and far more troubling. Hynek was leaving a trail, building a case, providing future researchers with hints about where to look and what questions to ask. He also began mentoring younger researchers, passing on his knowledge and connections. He made sure that when he died, there would be people who understood what he'd learned and could continue asking questions. After his death, archivists at the Centre for UFO Studies discovered how extensive his network had become. He'd been corresponding with scientists, journalists, military personnel, and intelligence community members across the country and around the world. Many of these correspondents came forward after his death, sharing letters and notes Hynek had sent them. The picture that emerged was of a man conducting a careful, decades-long campaign to preserve evidence and build support for serious scientific study, all while navigating the constraints of his security clearances and professional reputation. One archivist at QFOS said there were files he could never show publicly, and they vanished the same week he died. But he'd been preparing for that possibility. He'd shared information with enough people, in enough different places, that the core of what he knew survived even if the physical documents didn't. The question was whether anyone would be able to piece together the fragments he'd left behind. The real story is in the cases they never let him touch. Researchers estimate that approximately 20% of Project Blue Book's data was never made public. This isn't speculation. It's based on comparisons between the number of cases Blue Book officially investigated, 12,618, references in internal military documents to cases that don't appear in Blue Book's published reports, testimony from military personnel who filed UFO reports that never showed up in the official archive, analysis of Blue Book's case numbering system, which shows gaps suggesting removed cases. These were the cases involving military pilots reporting structured craft with no visible propulsion during active flight operations, not training exercises where misidentification might be understandable, but combat-ready pilots on routine patrol who encountered objects that outmaneuvered their aircraft. Radar operators tracking objects accelerating from stationary hover to thousands of miles per hour in seconds. Not atmospheric anomalies or equipment glitches, but solid returns tracked across multiple systems, sometimes visually confirmed by pilots. Incidents near nuclear installations, missile silos and strategic air bases. Sightings that occurred over the most sensitive military facilities, suggesting intelligence rather than random encounters. Events with physical evidence, scorched earth, radiation readings above background levels, electromagnetic interference with vehicle ignition and electronic systems, material samples that couldn't be identified, cases involving multiple categories of evidence simultaneously, visual sighting plus radar confirmation, plus physical effects, plus multiple witnesses. The cases where everything lined up and no conventional explanation fit. Hynek was systematically excluded from these cases. When he asked about them, he was told they involved national security. When he pressed for access, he was told the evidence was inconclusive or that the witnesses were unreliable. This despite some witnesses being highly trained military personnel with impeccable service records. He knew the pattern. The best evidence was always classified, always buried, always kept just out of reach. In his final interview with Rebecca Marks, Hynek said, "The real story is in the cases they never let me touch. That data still exists somewhere, locked in archives, hidden in compartmented programs, scattered across intelligence agencies that don't communicate with each other. Maybe it's in an Air Force vault at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. Maybe it's in CIA archives, filed under counterintelligence rather than aerial phenomena. Maybe it's in the National Reconnaissance Office, mixed in with satellite surveillance data. Maybe it's distributed across multiple agencies, each holding pieces of a puzzle none of them can see completely. And maybe, just maybe, there are people inside those agencies who know the full truth. People who've seen the evidence Hynek never could. People who understand what's been interacting with us for decades. People who carry the same burden Hynek carried, knowing something that changes everything but being unable to speak. The question is, will they ever tell us? Or will the phenomenon remain what it's always been? Something we glimpse, something we document, something we can never quite prove. A reality that exists in the gap between what we can observe and what we can conclusively demonstrate. J. Allen Hynek spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He started as a debunker and ended as a believer. He worked for the government and was betrayed by it. He maintained his scientific reputation, while quietly building a case for the phenomenon's reality. He wanted to tell the truth but was trapped by classification, career pressures, and the knowledge that some truths destroy the people who speak them too directly. In the end, he did what he could. He left clues. He built networks. He spoke carefully but persistently. He documented everything he could, knowing that someday someone might be able to piece together what he'd learned. And then he died. 3 months after giving an interview that someone thought was dangerous enough to erase. The tape is gone, but the questions remain. What did Hynek really know? What was in those missing files? Who decided the public couldn't handle the truth? And most importantly, is the phenomenon still active? Are unknown objects still being tracked, investigated, documented in classified programs we'll never hear about? Maybe someday we'll find out. Maybe the truth will emerge gradually through freedom of information requests and whistleblower testimony. Maybe some future equivalent of Hynek will decide the time has come to speak openly. Consequences be damned. Or maybe, like so many things in this field, we'll be left with fragments, hints, and the growing suspicion that reality is far stranger than we've been allowed to believe. One thing is certain. J. Allen Hynek believed the phenomenon was real. After 3 decades of study, after seeing the evidence firsthand, after witnessing the suppression and manipulation, he was convinced. And if someone with his credentials, his experience, his access to classified data came to that conclusion, maybe the rest of us should pay attention. Because if he was right, if the government really has been hiding the truth for 70 years, then we're living in a reality fundamentally different from the one we've been told exists, and that changes everything. This is Sleep Theories, where documented truth is stranger than fiction. Sleep well, and keep asking questions. Because somewhere, in a classified vault, in a forgotten archive, in the memory of aging intelligence officers who'll carry secrets to their graves, the truth is waiting. The truth J. Allen Hynek spent his life trying to reveal. The truth about what's been visiting us, watching us, studying us. The truth we're still not allowed to know, but someday, maybe we will. Someday.